Olá, aqui é o Nuno Viegas, do Fumaça. Esta é a primeira de 2 vezes em que me vou apresentar neste episódio. Peço desculpa, é só porque tinha umas notinhas para te deixar antes de começar a entrevista, que gravámos em maio passado. Primeiro, coisas sérias. Já estão online as contas do Fumaça para o último trimestre. Podes ver cada euro que recebemos e gastamos em fumaca.pt/transparência. Há lá uma folha de Excel que vai sendo atualizada ao longo do ano. Isto não é bem uma novidade. Mantemos há algum tempo uma política de transparência radical. Se pedimos doações a quem nos ouve, vê e lê, temos de mostrar para que é que as queremos e em que é que as gastamos. Ponto 2, mais alegre. Já andamos nisto há meia dúzia de anos, literalmente, e queremos celebrar. Este sábado, 16 de julho, estamos de porta aberta na nossa nova redação, em Lisboa, para festejar o 6º aniversário do Fumaça com todas as pessoas da comunidade. Se já tens uma contribuição mensal, podes vir entre as 2 e as 7 da tarde. Há comes, bebes e tempos para conversarmos sobre o que nos apetecer. Se ainda não pertence à comunidade, vais a tempo de me vires dizer em pessoa aquilo que não gostares neste episódio. É ir a fumaca.pt/contribuir, também entras nas nossas contas do próximo trimestre. E agora vou dizer o meu nome outra vez e apresentar a entrevistada de hoje, Sara Hyde. Até já. Olá, seja toda a gente bem-vinda ao Fumaça. Eu sou o Nuno Viegas. Hoje entrevisto a Sara Hyde, ativista prisional britânica, por estes dias em Portugal para a conferência Prison Insights 2022. A conversa será em inglês, salto para essa língua já para continuar a introdução, a bem da entrevistada perceber como a descrevo. Sara Hyde is a PhD candidate for criminology at the University of Nottingham, focusing on prison healthcare staff and deaths in custody. Over the past decade, she's been heavily involved in community activism around the penal system. Sara sat on a Ministry of Justice Advisory Board, authored criminal justice consultancy under the Justice Collective, and worked as a counsellor and group work facilitator at the largest women's prison in Western Europe, Holloway, which has since been shut down, as well as working with inmates after release. She is also the chair of the executive committee of the Fabian Women's Network and is an elected council for Islington with the Labour Party. I left many things out of that introduction and I hope I pronounced everything correctly. You do have a long CV, Sara. Oh. My apologies. And
My apologies. You did great.
I'd like to start off with the most broad question possible. In historical and in theoretical terms, and then get into the practical and break down specific aspects of the prison system. So, why do we lock people up?
That is a good question. And even having worked in and around prisons since 2008, I'm not sure I can answer it because I don't know if we have had that debate as a society. I don't know. I mean, there are many reasons that we kind of do, in fact, but how did this all start and why do we persist in doing it when we have such high recidivism rates and such terrible outcomes for people in prison and after prison? Why do we lock people up? I think, well, you asked a bit about the history, so maybe I should start there. I mean, we see the use of prison in some of the kind of, you know, the old historical manuscripts. Joseph in the Torah in the Old Testament is thrown in prison. You know, it's something that's been around for thousands and thousands of years. But how we end up with this current system, the current kind of Western prison system, you can trace some of its roots back through the debtors' prisons of the 18th century and through the 19th century when, sadly, lots of the prisons we have today in England and Wales were built in the 19th century and use that kind of Jeremy Bentham's panopticon model.
The Lisbon Central Prison is built in the same model.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that is enduring, isn't it? And this very like physical, punitive aspect of punishment, which Foucault's Discipline and Punish opens with a kind of description of like a public dismembering. And sometimes I think we have advanced and we have moved on from the kind of 18th and 19th century's views of prison and punishment. And other times I think we haven't at all, because although we don't have the death penalty in England and we don't do public flogging or dismembering, I think arguably psychologically we still pillory people.
The UK does have a policy of publishing the photos of convicted criminals and their names, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. And we call them all kinds of things, not just by the names they were given at birth. And and long after release, people are Googled and publicly shamed in a variety of ways, even if they are living like incredibly law-abiding and lives that are giving back or trying to, make the world a better place. So I think although we have stopped those physical practices, they're still kind of represented in how we regard people in prison and how we treat them. And we had a very modest number of people in prison compared to what we have today, even 30 years ago, actually, kind of up till the early 90s. And during the 90s, governments of both left and right wing in England and Wales introduced private prisons. They promoted them, and the prison population has just increased exponentially. So it's now double what it was. Sentences are getting longer. So that's a bit of a random skip through selected history of prison in England and Wales. Yeah. And I'm unaware at any point, even when we were introducing private prisons, that there was ever a nuanced or evidence-based debate about what are we doing? It's like we've got schools, we've got hospitals, we've got prisons. Next.
Yeah.
Because what are they for? Like, I know what a hospital is for. I know what a school is for. But we don't even agree on whether prison is the punishment or prison is for punishment.
That was my follow-up question.
Okay. Amazing.
Which is, putting aside its effectiveness and even the sincerity of its theoretical pillars, what's the stated goal of prison?
I mean,
what is it for?
Yeah, the prison service has a plaque up in every prison with its kind of stated goal on, which I would have to look up. I'm not going to try and repeat it verbatim because I'll get it wrong. But that isn't. The Ministry of Justice advisory panel that I sat on was around for the recruitment of magistrates. So they're people that sit in the lower court with less sentencing powers. Everyone has to go to magistrates first, and then I think it's about 10% of cases are referred to the Crown Court. So violent offences, murders, they go to Crown Court. But magistrates are dealing with the majority of people who drive too fast, through to some stealing and some common assault, things like that. But we used to ask magistrates, that was often something that we would ask people about, like what's the purpose? What's the purpose of prison? And there wasn't a right answer to that, but the diversity of responses that we gave, and this is for people who are really interested in the justice system, just demonstrated there's an absolute lack of consensus, there's a lack of nuance, there's a lack of debate. I mean, what should it be for? Different question. If you are designing it purely for rehabilitation, what would it look? If you agree that the punishment is the deprivation of liberty, then that's a completely different starting point to you're in prison and now we punish you.
And what are the positives of prisons?
So, well, I'm not going to say that there are none, because that would be untrue. The prisons as they are today in England and Wales, I don't think are really doing much good at all. However, there are pockets of good projects, good people. There are many good people, actually, that work in prison. There are compassionate, dedicated people doing their best in the face of a lot of horror and trauma and who are very under-resourced. So I would say some of the people that work in prisons are amazing. Some of the inmates who are getting through their sentence, inspiring other people, caring for other people, working hard. You meet a lot of very inspiring people. But obviously a lot of that work could be done in a better setting. When I worked at Holloway, one of the things that was good, but this is an indictment of the rest of society, was that women who maybe hadn't seen a dentist or an optician for years, who maybe had all kinds of complex intersecting physical and mental health problems, could actually receive some medical care and could receive holistic care. And maybe their substance misuse worker could talk to their psychiatrist, could talk to their, dentist or whoever it was about the impact of heroin on their teeth. And this didn't happen all the time, but sometimes in a best case scenario, there was really good holistic, like multi-agency working, which was facilitated because all of those partners worked in one building and, were sort of part of one team.
That's only a positive because society deeply failed them.
Exactly, right?
They should have access to that
100%.
outside.
Long before you get into the kinds of like entrenched issues that people, by the time they're in a prison, that's a thin end of the wedge, particularly for women. You're dealing with a very, very acute level and profound level of need. So, and I have heard people say, that prison sometimes was a rest for them because, again, life outside was mad. It was full of abuse, it was full of drugs, it was full of prostitution, or like all myriad things. And actually prison was a rest. And prison was 3 meals a day, however nutritionally questionable, but it's a bed and it's 3 meals a day. But it's also sharing a cell with somebody that maybe did something that is intolerable to you. It's having no control over when you shower, no control over what you eat, not being able to call your kids. The kind of range of damage just can't be offset by those small kind of good things. I hesitate to even call them good things.
If they didn't get 3 meals a day in the bed, there wouldn't be prisons as much as death camps.
Yeah.
So I follow your hesitation on putting that on the pro column.
Yeah.
Are prisons built primarily to be mechanisms of social control?
Yeah, I think they are. So we've had a few prisons in the last decade that have been built in England and Wales. They're built to be mechanisms of social control as constant surveillance. And they're all being built with finance in mind very much. Because the other thing about old prisons, they're not just rat infested, they're expensive, they're falling apart, the maintenance contracts, everything else, but they won't shut them. They would just much rather have people living in those kind of degrading and inhumane conditions. So when they build the new prisons, I'm thinking of places like HMP Oakwood and HMP Bowen, the one in Wrexham, HMP 5 Wells. The newer prisons, they are often looking at what is the... When Oakwood opened in, I think it was 2012, it used to be called HMP Jokewood, and they were looking for... they were doing a benchmarking exercise nationwide, and they were like, right, per capita, how much does the prison place cost? And how can we say Oakwood's a shining example of, can we incarcerate people for like £12,000 a year rather than at the time it was about £54,000 a year per person, I believe. And I understand now it's more like £45,000 a year per person. And they've done that through systematic cuts to staff, building these mega prisons, which again, all research tells us you want small local units, not 3,000 person out of town prisons. So I think it is very much about social control, and it's doing it at the lowest price. So then you're not thinking about what is the impact of this social control more broad.
It's a cheap way to demonstrate state power. Yeah,
it's warehousing people essentially, rather than treating people as people. It's a kind of commodification. I think it's how commodification and that sort of more broader neoliberal agenda has affected how we think of prison. It's about unit cost. And so how can we separate the bad people, quote unquote, that's not how I would call them, but the bad people at the cheapest possible rate with like no consideration for the kind of, the onward impact. And if you just want to take the purely financial argument, the fact that if you actually invested properly in services and people, that it probably long term would also save you money. But the kind of austerity agenda didn't allow for any of that kind of thinking.
I'd like to get into the effects of it now and not think about financing and how much it would cost. So in a 2017 study, the Very Institute of Justice, an NGO that advocates for the end of mass incarceration, found that in the United States of America, jailing more people had, and I'm quoting, a marginal to zero impact on crime. In some examples, though, data actually show the higher incarceration rate can lead to an increase in crime. A 1983 study of crime rates in England and Wales found lower imprisonment rates have no impact on the level of public safety.
Yeah.
Don't prisons make us safer?
I mean, for the most part, no. For the most part, no. We had in the UK, similarly, the National Audit Office also did a study that found that the crime rate bore no relation to the incarceration rate. And as I said, we've seen a doubling in the incarceration rate over about the last 30 or so years. So we don't have to, it's not difficult for us to do those sums because we've had such an exponential rise in the number of people in prison. You know, I'm not daft. If somebody's done something profoundly wrong and profoundly damaging, then of course there needs to be a separation from day-to-day life. There needs to be a sanction. But something needs to happen. Society can't function unless we reckon, you know, with these difficult things. But there is so much evidence to suggest that particularly when it's low-level offences, you know, like over 80% of women are incarcerated for non-violent offences. And with men, it's about 70%. It's not even that different. Do you know what I mean? It's like the damage that's done when somebody goes into prison and they lose their house and they can't see their children and they lose their job and then they go to prison where, you know, quite often people tell me they learn how to do crime more effectively, better, brilliant, where there's a rife, you know, drug problems are rife.
They're known as crime schools.
Crime schools, exactly, spice, you know, all the stuff that's going on there and the underinvestment. And to expect people to come out the other side, I mean, there are lots of charities, there are lots of NGOs in there, and as I said, there's lots of individuals doing good work. But to just expect a spell in a place like that to just do abstractly somehow, like what's going to come through the walls through osmosis, that people are going to be rehabilitated and pop out the other side as good. I'm like, I don't understand. I just sort of think, if you met people, I don't know if you know about people, you know, and what people need to thrive. And I'm a big believer in that kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which just starts with like food, water, shelter, and then feeling safe. And prisons, I'm not even sure we're kind of on the bottom tier. And things like self-actualization in Maslow's hierarchy of needs are right up the top after quite a lot of other work's gone on. And really, that's sort of what we're saying to people in prison. You need to pop out and be law-abiding without really understanding what led them to commit crime in the first place. Yeah.
So your point is prisons don't reduce crime?
They do in the immediate sense of that person isn't then able to go to Iceland and shoplift or a supermarket and shoplift, but it does nothing to tackle any of the root causes and very little to help people shift and change. And the evidence just isn't there to support a big and growing prison population to drive down crime. I mean, there's all kinds of graphs. I know this is audio, but you can, you know, sometimes the visual representation of the kind of prison numbers and the crime rates are absolutely fascinating. And
with how disparate they are.
They're going in different directions. So I was looking at a study earlier, and it's a study about long-term prisoners, so people that are given sentences of 20 years or more. And let me get this right. Between 2009 and 2019, 4 times as many people got a 20-year plus sentence, and there was a 44% decrease in serious crime. So they're not exactly the same correlation because serious crime is a broader category, but there was a 44% decrease in serious crime at the time that we've now incarcerated 4 times more people for over 20 years. So we're not, you know, it's not proportionate, and it doesn't follow that just because our prisons are getting fuller, oh, we've got more crime. We've actually got less crime, but we're still filling up our prisons. Yeah. So we're not filling our prisons because they work and because we've got a bigger crime problem. That's to do with, you know, laws and sentencing.
Sure. But let's assume that actual incarceration isn't diminishing crime rates, that, you know, as the Varia Institute states, 75 to 100% of decreases in violent crime in the US can be explained by factors other than penal policy, such as increased wages, increased employment, increased law enforcement personnel. Even then, isn't it logical to believe that the threat of prison, the threat of state power and imprisonment, inhibits a substantial amount of criminality from taking place?
I don't know what the evidence is for that. So I don't know what the public attitudinal kind of surveys would tell us about that. But I do know that for some of the people I met and for some of the things that are driving crime, so addiction, when you're off your face and robbing so that you can stay off your face, who cares how long you're going to get? It's not when you're terrified and in a gang and you're carrying a knife or knives because of your own deep fear and myriad other circumstances. It's not a deterrent to you that you can get 4 years in the UK just for carrying that knife. That's not a meaningful deterrent. Like, meaningful work there is youth work and how we in this position that you can't leave your postcode, or, you know, and like deep addressing childhood trauma type work and heavier sentencing. I don't think that translates. It might do for some people and for a section of society, but then there's a kind of section of other people that the causes of their offending is such it bears very little relation to, well, I'm not going to do that because I might get that kind of sanction.
Deterrents only work if there's at least a modicum of free will. Free will as in there's not such a pressure to, there's a context that leads you to that way.
Yeah, and all kinds of people I've got no idea what sentences are. I do a bit of the kind of attitudinal survey work that the Sentencing Council did have shown that people assume that our sentences are more punitive than they are, but they also think public attitudes show that people think we should have less punitive sentences. Actually, when you say to them, for this offence, what would you give people? And they always underestimate what it should be. But that doesn't come across, in the kind of broader media. And I just think, I can't remember the statistic now, but there's a huge amount of offending that happens while people are drunk and things like that. And it's just not, do you know what I mean? There's something about the whole system that is dehumanising, and the act of many, many, many crimes is profoundly dehumanising. So it's like not connected to rationality and like, I won't do X and Y because it might hurt another human and that will mean this longer sentence. It's some other place, really.
In the United Kingdom, 75% of inmates go back to prison within 9 years of release. In the United States of America, 75% of prisoners go back to jail within 5 years of release.
Wow.
We don't have official data in Portugal, but the Portuguese ombudsperson, the Provedoria de Justiça, said back in 2003 that the reincarceration rate was about 50%. In what way do prisons rehabilitate the people we lock inside them?
Wow. So, I feel like I need to take a moment with those figures because that's really powerful, because I don't know if I've ever seen those cumulative figures. They're very keen on like, this year, 54% of people at this age, but over 9 years, 75%. That is mind-blowing, hey? So, as I said, there is some good work. There are housing workers, there are drugs workers, there are 12-step programs that people can work if you can get to them. This all relies on there being enough staff to take you out of your cell and take you somewhere, or, it relies on the third sector, charities, NGOs, to be able to come into the prison and get access to get their staff security check to come into the prison. It relies on it not being a time of COVID where people were locked in their cell 23 hours a day for months and months. So, imagining it's not a time of COVID, imagining there are enough staff. There's education departments in prisons, there's healthcare in prisons, and we know that both physical and mental health have an impact on recidivism. And there are resettlement teams in prison that often, again, have specialist housing. Maybe in a good scenario, you might get somebody from the Department of Work and Pensions who'll come in and say to you, this is how, let's look at getting you set up so that when you come out, you can access your benefits more quickly, so that you might have somewhere to live, you might be able to buy some food, you might, but that is so reliant on the specificity of the prison.
And getting lucky.
Yeah, yeah. And there's just some prisons that just have got really good like voluntary sector in there, or really innovative people pioneering great stuff. But it is in no way blanket. It's not. The 118 prisons across the UK have very, very diverse scenarios. It is partly because some of them might be a high security prison, or that some of them might be for longer sentence prisoners, so there's a diversity in the categorisation of prisons, so it wouldn't be appropriate, and you wouldn't need a resettlement department in every prison. Sorry, I'm just thinking the ones I've worked in all had resettlement. But there's just no kind of standardisation, and so a lot of it's potluck, and it's also kind of like, can you hustle well? Do you get on with the officers? Can you find your way through so that you can access the things you need, whether that be education or health stuff, so that when you come out the other end, things might go well for you.
But at this point, looking at the broad picture of it, do prisons rehabilitate people? Because if you went to the hospital,
Yeah.
and the death rate on treating the flu was 75%, you wouldn't say the hospital heals people. People just die in there.
Yeah.
So can we at all say it works?
I mean, I know some extraordinary individuals that have come out the other side of prison and now do incredible things with their lives, you know, running organisations, helping other people. And so they came out the other side of a prison experience, I'm going to say, quote, unquote, rehabilitated. But did the prison do that? I'm not so sure. I think that's down to their personal tenacity.
So some people rehabilitate themselves within a prison, but the system itself isn't built for.
I feel like despite, they did it despite. It was in no way an enabling environment. But again, I say that, but I am aware I don't want to do down the work of something like a 12-step program might be really powerful and somebody might finally.
But you can get into a 12-step program without prison.
No, yeah, 100%. 100%. I mean, 100%. But do you see what I mean? I'm just aware of some colleagues doing some like profoundly life-changing work in prisons, and I don't want to just rubbish that.
Yeah. Well, but not putting that aside, I'd like to. And you touched on this this morning when you spoke at Prison Insights. My question is, are prisons built to appease those who remain free rather than to help those whose liberty they limit?
Yeah, I mean, who are they built for? I don't even know, because I think, they're partly built, I think, to appease, in England and Wales, a kind of imaginary voter, a vengeful voter. It's always quite a politically, tricky topic. And that's what I mean about when you get into some of the research about people's actual attitudes towards things like sentence length. People aren't as punitive as some parts of our mainstream media would make out. And I sort of think, gosh, are these being built to satisfy the worst excesses of the right-wing parts of our media? And actually, which of the citizens do want this, keep building? And when you explain to people like, oh, we've got twice as many people in prison now as we had 30 years ago, people are genuinely surprised. And then they almost always say, what, because there's more crime? Do you know, people aren't stupid, and I think sometimes politicians and the media might treat, there's a weird manipulation, and the media will say, oh, we're just reflecting what our readers want, and it's like, no, you're stoking fear, rather than trying to share stories from inside, promote understanding, talk about the reality of crime or the reality of some of the people who are committing these crimes. It's very kind of fear-mongering. And so I think, why are we building these? And why in a country where we have all these crumbling Victorian prisons, 175-year-old Pentonville prison, when we're building new prisons, we're not then saying, oh, we'll close this rat-infested, crumbling one. We just keep going. Just expanding capacity. And it feels like we're going in that direction that the United States is going in, where that kind of penal industrial complex is so clearly linked to profit, and driving we need more jobs in this area, and so we need more incarceration capacity so we can incarcerate more people for jobs and for our shareholders. And it can feel like that is the direction of travel, and we're building prisons for shareholders, actually, and local economy arguments, when you're like, really, is this the best we can do to invigorate a local economy? Really, a prison? That's a sad indictment of our imagination and our ability to deal with other societal issues. Yeah, so I sort of wonder, are we building prisons for shareholders and for some imaginary public that the right-wing press claim are out there?
You touched on this before. The Council of Europe annual penal statistics for last year puts the median ratio of inmates per staff at 1.5 incarcerated people for every staff member. Yeah. And that's a tricky number to point down of what staff, what are we counting here. But that's the exact number for England and Wales. Portugal is the 10th worst out of the 49 countries analysed. We have 1.9 inmates per staff member. What's the impact of understaffing on rehabilitation?
So I'm surprised that it's 1.5. I mean, that sounds...
It probably has a broad comprehension of staff.
Because I think it's more... Yeah, I think it's far less than that in terms of officers, but yeah. Staff.
In terms of officers, this isn't just officers.
Okay, I think, so if we accept that the causes of crime The deep, deep profound causes of crime are often things like adverse childhood experiences, which are things like emotional abuse and trauma. Emotional abuse, trauma, violence in the home, domestic abuse in the home, a parent who's an alcoholic. Those are the kind of things we're talking about. Those are all fundamentally about damaged relationship. Okay, sorry, this is a slightly long-winded answer, but that is fundamentally about damaged relationship and then as a child not having your needs met because your relationships are so damaged, you weren't able to thrive as you would wish a child to do so. And then you probably end up in relationships with institutions as well who then don't, either in the care system or, in kind of pupil referral units we have when people are excluded from mainstream school. Things like that again, are damaging really to your sense of relationship. So fast forward to then somebody being in prison. For me, I can't overestimate how powerful a relationship with somebody in authority that is positive can be. That is powerful in terms of rehabilitation or habilitation even. Because lots of the women I worked with had just not experienced another adult treating them with dignity, treating them with respect. So we used to talk a lot about trying to have a reparative attachment because the kind of childhood attachments had been so damaged and so broken. And so just to say to somebody I'm going to turn up every week at this time because you're worth it. And, I care about you. I care about what happens to you. And, I'm not important in the grand scheme of your life, obviously. But just to have a setting where somebody who has more power than you, gives you the time of day, listens to you, wants to know about you, cares about what happens to you next, is powerful. And when you haven't got enough staff, so you might be on a really busy wing and you've got people on suicide watch, you've got people who are sick, you've got somebody kicking off, you've got someone on the cell bell, you've got, it's really hectic. And you might have 50 people, 70 people, depends on your prison, depends on the wing. And you might notice that Anna, isn't quite herself, but you haven't got any time to check. You just sort of notice it in the kind of general madness of everything going on. Whereas prison staff have always been stretched, right? But certainly in the time that I worked in Holloway, the benchmarking exercise happened. There was loads of people took voluntary redundancies. The staff radically changed. So you lost staff that had been there 20 plus years who had got their jail craft, as they call it, just down. They knew that balance of care and security. They knew how to de-escalate. They knew how to demonstrate compassion whilst keeping people safe. Extraordinary level of skill doing that. Extraordinary. Lots of those staff went and there was less staff. So, for example, if I was in the prison after 5 p.m, the door between two wings would be open because rather having 3 staff on this wing, 3 staff on this wing, you then suddenly had 3 staff across the wings. And it was things like that, really tangible. So when the prison was in night mode, they had far less staff across less space. So then when incidents happen and difficult things happen, there's less people to respond, there's less, and all of that stuff feeds into this idea of a rehabilitative journey. If you can't get the basics right of keeping people safe, of good healthcare, good mental health care, good addiction services, you can't get near this idea of rehabilitation. And for me, the best kind of justice system would be absolutely foundationally based on good, respectful human relationships. And that just goes out the window and it becomes about the numbers rather than the humans in front of you.
And you point at staff cuts as a major cause of this. It was a problem before, it's got worse because you cut the staff. But looking at the opposite end of the spectrum, couldn't prisons, by sharply reducing incarceration rates, address the same issue? So if you had much less prisoners and the same number of staff, we could get to a rehabilitation point.
Yeah, and there's a lot of just ineffective short sentences. What you can lose in 3 months in prison is like your whole life, basically. Your job, family relationships, your home. And lots of people that are getting those kind of sentences could as easily have a more effective community treatment order or something like that, addressing, sometimes they come with an addiction stipulate. There are different kinds of community treatment orders, service orders that magistrates can hand out. And, Yeah, and it just that would be a very easy place to start.
We've mostly done that in Portugal. Prison
excellent.
sentences under 3 years are suspended unless
3
you
years.
commit a crime again. So if
Yeah.
you commit a crime again, you go
That's a
you go
suspended
in, but
sentence.
anything under 3 years
Yeah.
is a suspended sentence.
Gosh, and has that made a big difference to the population?
To the prison population, no, it rose.
Oh, okay. Wow. But do you think? I wonder if your sentencers just thought, oh, well, we better give everyone 3.5 years now rather than 3 months.
The major issue is there's a large percentage of the population that is in for drug offences, and drug offences are 3 to 5 years.
Okay, I see.
So they are still getting the most people that got suspended. That would get suspended sentences aren't the people that are mostly getting convicted anyway.
Okay, I see. Yeah, I think and this is the kind of territory you think, oh, if you really want to shift the argument, it's like, what is the evidence? What is the evidence? And the evidence is that short sentences do not work, and they destroy people's the social networks, the things that stop you from reoffending, like your home, your job. We know that these they absolutely reduce reoffending. And when you stick someone inside for 3 months, 6 months, that all falls apart. Whereas if you could have given them a community order, I'm not saying everyone can just walk around doing whatever they like with no sanction. I'm not saying that at all. But again, it's like, get to the heart of the matter. What's the evidence say? The evidence says having a job, having a home, far less likely to reoffend. So let's keep that going and let's treat this in the community.
But have we built prisons ever based on evidence and data?
Oh, do you know, I genuinely don't know. I'm sure somebody at the Ministry of Justice would tell you that some of the new ones are built with the latest, whatever, with the in-cell. Some of them got phones in their cells now, and during the pandemic, some people, again, this totally depended which prison you're in, were able to use iPads to communicate with their family, and they'll tell you
but the system itself,
because of evidence, because of the Pharma Review about family links, which they mostly ignore, but sometimes, raise. But, but I mean, I really don't know. But that is a good question.
Are there prison models that result in lower reincarceration rates?
Actual prisons. There are. Let me get this right. I'm a big fan of HMP Grendon, which is a therapeutic prison in the UK, in England, that I think has about a 20% reoffending rate, last time I looked.
How do they do that?
Well, there's a couple of things. And we have to be real about this, because you're not going to get what we would call a category B local prison, which is it's not high security, it's one down, where you're going to have a high churn of in and out. I don't know how you make a 1,500 person local prison a therapeutic environment. Mm-hmm. Well, I do, but it costs a lot of money, and I can't see any government would ever do that, right? So, but one thing about Grendon is you have to be sentenced for. So, A, they don't have anyone on remand. B, I think you have to have 2 years. I'm going to get this wrong, but this is from memory. I think you have to still have something like 2 years left on your sentence at least. Mm-hmm. So they know that they can work with you, in a trauma-informed way, in a therapeutic community over a sustained period of time. And when you're talking about the level of childhood trauma that a lot of people in prison are bringing, that is what's required. But we could do some of that stuff in the community, right? Mm-hmm. Because not everyone's childhood trauma results in offences or serious offences, obviously. But why do we have to get to the stage of it being a prison therapeutic community when actually lots of people would be better off in addiction services, in other or in mental health institutions?
I'll let you jump into that in a sec. But I'd like to know, what's the prison population there?
Oh, I can't remember off the top of my head. I'm going to say 500.
Okay.
I'm possibly making that up. It might be less.
That's still large, isn't it?
I'm going to have to look that up.
You generally advocate for smaller prisons.
Absolutely.
What's the benefit of it?
Smaller prisons?
Yeah.
It's less like being a tiny, invisible, insignificant number in a massive machine that has no humanity. There's just something dehumanising about the whole system. You get a number right from the get-go. There you are. Where there's no humanity in that, and being kept with 1,800 other people, sometimes 2 or 3 in a room designed for one person, that it just strips out the humanity. And it's harder to tailor anything, but when you've got a specific category prison, a smaller prison, a more settled prison population, so I'm talking about somewhere like Grendon where the people are there for a long time, you're able to respond, I think, to the need in front of you in a way that you're just not when you're talking about high numbers and high turnover. One of the other prisons that does often come out quite well is a place called Warren Hill, and I think there's about 350 people there. There's Alison Liebling and colleagues at Cambridge do a quality of prison life study, and Warren Hill comes out well. But again, that is a prison that has got no remand. It's a stable population. It's people with longer sentences. So there's just you're just starting from a different point. But what I guess I'm interested in is if we have to have prisons, which, you know, or have to use prisons in the way that we use them at the moment, what can we learn from these what does the kind of remand prison version of that look like? What's realistic about what we can do with somebody that we don't know how long they're going to be here, and, you know, all the kind of things with remand or people getting transferred, things like that. But I think ideally there would be a far more therapeutic approach that got into the causes of this stuff.
And do community measures, so temporary releases, flexible sentences, home arrests, community services, do those options work better than prisons? Yeah,
the evidence for community, there's a variety. You've just alluded to some of them. There's a variety of evidence. And it's not like, they work 100% of the time. There's no reoffending. Obviously not. But there is a far better, there's evidence for them working better. But there's been a study recently that because of all the cuts to probation, often people get a community option when there's been a pre-sentence report. And there's far less pre-sentence reports being done. So then people are far less likely to get a community option. And you get into this kind of vicious cycle. But I think there's plenty of offences that are suited to, they started using these kind of alcohol dermal bracelets as well, the abstinence bracelets, through to the tags or other kind of thing, which maybe in some other universe, we might not use those either. But I just think all of those things allow you to potentially keep your job, maintain your family relationships and your home, versus a system that takes all that away.
If those models exist, and they're generally much cheaper than having someone in prison, and they are more effective, why don't we pursue them?
I think it's about the political will, because I think people in the wider society often just don't know about the evidence for what drives crime, what reduces crime. And a lot of our penal policy is done on feelings, and politicians who want to win elections have to pay attention to what they perceive to be public feeling. And it's not necessarily...
But the public feeling is constructed.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily expedient for politicians to spend lots of time really understanding what the public think about particular issues. And so I think it's very difficult, because all of this is also happening in this wider context of where we are culturally and as a society. And I do think we are more aligned to some of the American cultural norms and perhaps to some of the rest of Europe, particularly with our departure from the EU, particularly with the Prime Minister we've got at the moment being, some people call him our Donald Trump, things like that. That gives you the context that we're working in, the kind of limitations in a way. And so if you're trying to shift culture, shift the dial, and really help educate people a bit, bring people with you a bit, say, actually, this does matter to everybody in society because, your taxes are paying for it, or you're living in fear of X, Y, and Z, but actually, statistically, it's very unlikely to happen. And did you know that? But it's like, how can we have those individual conversations and get kind of cultural change and get stories out there of people's lives and how people have changed and overcome, incredible disadvantage? How do we educate the public, I guess, so that then the media, politicians, etc., the people who could make quite different laws are able to think, I could consider that. Because I feel a bit like we're locked in a bit of a vicious circle.
Because that feels like a cop-out, doesn't it? The public doesn't know about it, so now I have to make terrible laws.
I do. I think that we need some bold vision, some bold ideas, and find ways to tell those stories. Stories are powerful. Stories are powerful. And sometimes there'll be a film, there'll be something on television, and people will message me and they'll say, oh my goodness, did you see X? I didn't realise it was like that in prison. And you're sort of thinking, well, sort of isn't. But often those are the things that people very rarely say to me, oh, I read a research paper and now I think completely differently about sentencing or what, It's stories, it's humanity, it's when it touches our lives, it's restorative justice programs, it's things, just finding those points of connection, which is why the kind of atomization of society is so dangerous anyway. But just, listening to somebody else's story, connecting as humans, I think that's the kind of powerful. And that's a very unsatisfactory answer to your big picture question, but I'm like, it's sort of one person at a time.
Yeah. Do you believe in the notion of criminals as a category of people?
Do you know what? I don't. I really don't. Even people that have done some of the worst imaginable things, they have other parts in their identity. They have other words that describe them. They might be a mother, they're someone's brother. They might have been a teacher. They might be really witty, really kind, or capable of great kindness. And and I think this is one of the struggles of being human, is acknowledging within ourselves, within myself, there's the capacity for great kindness, sure, but I have the capacity also for great evil. But I wouldn't want to be known forever by the thing that I did on my worst day and have everything else about me overlooked because of one thing. But that's very difficult, because when we're talking about the serious end of things, the incredibly serious end of things, the devastation that those kind of crimes cause, you can't deny that. And so I wouldn't want to minimise the harm, the damage that is done by serious sexual offending, by murder, the damage is huge. And I also come back to this thing, though, what does the evidence say? What's going to help us? And I don't think treating people as criminal or as monsters or as separate or as incomprehensible helps move us on in terms of society, in terms of rehabilitation, in terms of making the place safer so that doesn't happen again.
But do you believe that everyone can be rehabilitated?
Apart from a very, very few people.
But there are a few people who you think can't be.
It's not that they can't be. I think some people are so profoundly ill. Or some people who are offending later on in their lives, the damage in their belief systems and everything is so deep. I guess I would never say never, but I think in reality there are a handful of people kicking around where it's very hard yards to see how that's going to turn out. And I'm not talking about they're going to be released and do all sorts of awful things, but I'm talking about those attitudes or those deep, deep beliefs, the impact of deep, deep trauma. I'm an optimist, so I would never say never, but I do think there's a handful where,
If I allow me to make the populist argument here.
Please.
How can you rehabilitate, for example, Emma Tustin and Thomas Hughes, who were convicted in the UK for torturing and murdering their 6-year-old son?
Oh gosh, that case, yeah.
Yeah, I had to Google it. I'm not very well aware of what crime.
I've got young children, and that really, that's heavy. I mean, it's heavy, heavy stuff. But if we incarcerate people who've done things like that and throw away the key and never look at them again, what are they? They're just going to rot and die, in which case, okay. So this comes back to your earlier points. We haven't got the death penalty, right? But so if we literally do nothing and just let somebody die, that's kind of the death penalty. So assuming that person's going to come back out into society at some point again, well, what are we doing? How do we? Surely we should be doing everything we can so that can never happen again, and it should never be. They should never be able to perpetrate that again. But I don't think that equals locking them up, throwing away the key, because why? I mean, I read a bit about that case, but I found I could barely read the details because it was so distressing. And there's been a couple of cases in the UK in the last year, like a little girl called Star as well as Arthur, that have just you can barely read them. You can barely get through reading them. But I think it's important as somebody that cares about these things to understand what we're talking about so that I don't get in my ivory tower and, so that I'm real about the impact of these crimes. But in somewhere, it was two people that did that.
Mm-hmm.
It was two human beings that did that. And I believe that they are capable of change. Mm. And I don't know them. I don't know how they got into the place or I just don't know how they got into getting their heads around all of that. They probably didn't. That's the whole thing. It's a dehumanising crime, isn't it? That level of systematic, ongoing child abuse of your own child in one person's case there. But they are still humans, and we have to understand that those very, very damaged people then went on to damage somebody else to the point where he died. Mm. And it's like, we've got to grapple with that as a civilised society. We've all agreed that we're not doing death penalty. We're not doing public decapitations anymore. We don't do that. So what do we do?
And how do you reintroduce them to society after 20 years, after 10 years?
Yeah, with great care. And again, ideally, having had intensive therapeutic work to understand what the actual, how on earth did that happen? Mm-hmm. For them personally and individually as responsible actors, how did that happen? How are they living with themselves? I think that was one of the really interesting things for me when I worked in prisons. Lots of the people I worked with talked about the difficulty with reconciling themselves with their offence and what they had done. And that requires to be in normal life, right? We don't want to say, oh yeah, I did steal that Mars bar or whatever. So when you're talking about something like that, it's like, how do you live with yourself? That's a lot of work.
How do I admit it to myself?
Yeah. How do I do it? It's much easier to be like, oh, I'm just here accidentally, front it. How can we all find a place of honesty within ourselves about the things we've done wrong in our lives, whether they are minor misdemeanours or illegal or through to the very heavy end? And how do we make that an acceptable part of who I am, of my humanity? I think that's a really big question for us when we're reckoning with this stuff.
8 out of every 10 Portuguese prisoners haven't graduated high school.
Wow.
6 out of 10 worked low-skill and low-wage jobs before being arrested. In the United Kingdom, there are 80% more crimes registered in low-income neighbourhoods than in rich areas. Do poor people just commit more crimes?
No. No, they don't. I was like, gosh, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because I always thought you just go and rob stuff from the nice areas. But obviously that's just one kind of crime. Yeah. No, poverty, well, there's a couple of things. Like, there's more crime often in low-income neighbourhoods because poverty, there's a connection. We know there's correlation, I should say, rather, between poverty and crime. And class and crime, and not because people from particular backgrounds are more predisposed to criminality or anything nonsense like that. It's also about how you are treated by the system, and if the way that the justice system in its broader sense and law enforcement agents treat someone who's street homeless with a 10 bag of crack on them compared to how they treat somebody who's running a business in the city with a gram of coke. People aren't treated with an even hand either. So we criminalise people in different situations.
Is it just easier to police, arrest and prosecute poor people?
It probably is. I don't know the evidence for that, but in terms of some of the things that I've seen, just in terms of who's going to defend you in the court, right? Have you got some incredible barrister, the best money can buy for some very minor offence, but because you've got money or your family knows somebody and they'll do you a favour, you've got this incredible barrister who, the magistrate or the jury don't stand a chance against? Or have you got the duty solicitor who's paid an absolute pittance going all over the country to magistrates' courts, barely has time to read your notes before getting up to defend you, and that's not, those individuals are amazing. It's not to do with their level of skill, it's to do with their workload and the pressures on them. who's gonna get the better outcome there? So there's a way in which kind of class and privilege and money play through the whole system. Similarly, when you get out, it's like, my dad's going to put me in a flat for the next 6 months while I get on my feet. Great for that individual, but that isn't most people's experience. Most people come out 56 quid, nowhere to live, no job. Or, my mum's got a mate who will have me in a bakery so I can start to get something on my CV. Or, all of that social capital has an impact. So it's kind of through the whole system, not just at the point where I haven't got enough money to feed my kids, especially at the moment in the UK, what's going on with our cost of living crisis. But I met women in prison frequently who are there for shoplifting to feed their children. And you just think, we're one of the richest countries in the world and people are literally shoplifting to feed their children.
Have we criminalised poverty?
Yeah, to a large extent. To a large extent, yeah. And it's kind of horrifying and terrifying. And all the indicators for things like child poverty in the UK are going the wrong way, and the cost of living crisis. And that's why it's so kind of terrifying.
The National Institute of Justice, part of the US government, has found that the children of incarcerated people are more likely to experience psychological strain, antisocial behavior, suspension or expulsion from school, economic hardship, and criminal activity. When we jail a parent, are we pushing a family into a generational cycle of incarceration?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of evidence for this. I mean, absolutely devastating evidence for this across the piece, in the UK, it was estimated for a long time that on any given day, I think it was 108,000 children had a parent in prison. But then there was a recent piece of work in 2019 by Crest Advisory, and they found, using very robust methodology, that it was more like 312,000 children, well, a year. So it wasn't on any given day, it was a slightly different metric. But 312,000 children a year had a parent in prison. And I know across the EU, what they're called? The European Children of Prisoners Europe estimated it was 800,000 on any given day. 800,000 children EU-wide had a parent in prison. And again, the Sentencing Project in the States, they reckon 2.7 million children on any given day had an incarcerated parent. And it is that is breathtaking. That is breathtaking. What are we doing? What are we doing? And that's why earlier on when you're saying to me things like, does prison do good? I was like, I don't want to do down the good, but it's just stuff like that when you know what the outcomes are for children of prisoners. And now, having nieces and nephews and being a parent, I just, I'm here, I'm away from my kids for 2 nights of my own volition, having this incredible privilege to come and, do this talking thing at this conference. And I'm still a bit like, 2 nights without my kids. And I'm like, it blows my mind that we do this all the time. And of course, it isn't that people that have children should be immune from prosecution or immune from, legal sanctions. I'm not advocating that, but it's just about, it's your point again, like, what is this all for? What are we doing? Are we trying to take damage out of the system? Are we trying to bring reconciliation? Are we trying to rehabilitate? Or is punishment the most important thing? Because what we have at the moment would absolutely suggest that punishment is the most important thing in the face of all of the evidence, all of the testimonies of those who lived experience. That Crest Advisory report in 2019, it also had the statistic that 65% of the sons of prisoners end up in the justice system themselves. Not necessarily in prison, but involved in the justice system. 65%. I mean, that is a madness that we just allow that to continue unabated, because all of the evidence, and that's why things like the Pharma Review in the UK are really important about the importance of family relationship. Now, some people in prison don't have children, and some people's family are the problem. Let's not be naive about this. It's a complicated picture. But for large numbers of people, if we could maintain, and it's a reason not to reoffend. I want to be with my family. I want to see my kids. I want to have a better relationship with them. I want to do better for them. I want to show them that change is possible. Like those kind of things people have said to me over the years. And so we really miss a trick when we ignore that whole dynamic, because I think it's really crucial.
Since we're on the topic of kids, a 2015 study from the MIT found that in the state of Illinois, in the US, 40% of all minors incarcerated as juvenile offenders ended up in an adult prison by the time they were 25 years old. A 1999 analysis by the state of New York shows that 4 out of every 5 juvenile inmates in the state were arrested for new crimes within 6 years of their release. When we arrest a minor, do we in practice sentence them to a life in prison?
I think that would be a bit of an oversimplification, but it's certainly true to say that we could be doing a lot better by our young people. And that
How should we deal with juvenile offenders?
I think a principle of keeping them out of institutions for as long as possible is a good one. There is lots of evidence around the fact that the best thing for reducing reoffending is the 30th birthday. That's the kind of, but that's still quite a lot of somebody's life. If you start out at 13, 14, that's still quite a long time. So we can't just wait for people to kind of, grow out of it. That's a bit flippant. It's not really a solution. But I think, again, we know that the causes of crime often are in those adverse childhood experiences. So it's like, how are we working with families? How are we working with children who are in our care system or who have an addicted parent? How are we making sure people aren't being groomed into gangs or trafficked or sexually exploited or carrying drugs around the country? We've got a big problem with county lines in the UK. How are we intervening there? And within our youth offending system, how are we acknowledging the kind of victimhood, the joint identity often? Well, there's many, but that kind of traumatised child and the victim that is often presenting alongside the perpetrator. How do we resolve that? One of the things I'm passionate about is reducing violence against women and girls. And in particular, I mention this now because in my local authority, there was a time where all of our kind of high prolific perpetrators in the youth offending team, the thing they had in common wasn't ethnicity or class or, it was that they had all grown up in a home with domestic violence, all of them. And there was something about joining those dots and thinking, right, well, the reason that eliminating domestic abuse is important is because of the victims in the primary instance, but the children as well and what people learn in that environment. So again, it's having this very holistic, joined up, multi-agency approach that acknowledges that's what, this is where you're coming from, these experiences. We can't expect these things to be undone in a heartbeat. If you've had a childhood full of that, that's all you've ever known. How long is it going to take to undo that? And it's possible, but it's about support. It's about one-to-one, it's about...
It's about everything we talked about.
Yeah, exactly. And that takes time and it costs money. But once people are in the system, sure, it's hard to get them out. And there's a very direct link in the UK between school exclusion and incarceration. And so I also think it's about looking at how we use school exclusions and discouraging, trying to keep kids in mainstream education so we don't set up this pipeline from pupil referral units to prisons, which is often what can happen.
I don't know if you have them, but apart from juvenile centres, we have actual prison schools.
Right.
Then for under 23-year-olds who just go to that prison, which is the prison school in William.
Okay, yeah, I don't...
In the United Kingdom, a report from last year found that 45% of adults in prisons have anxiety or depression, 8% have a diagnosis of psychosis, and 60% have experienced a traumatic brain injury. Yeah. For the US, the Treatment Advocacy Center estimates that 20% of inmates suffer from a serious mental illness. I'll ask this in the most provocative way.
Yeah, go for it.
Are we jailing the sick instead of treating them?
Yeah, I'm very happy with that provocation. I'm happy, it's so clear to me when I came across that acquired brain injury stat a while ago, 60% of people have some kind of brain injury in the UK.
It's a staggering number, isn't it?
Yeah, more than half. What are we doing? 25% of women have this, have a diagnosis of psychosis. And just knowing, having been to court with people and having then worked with people in prison waiting for a transfer out to a secure hospital, all of those kinds of things. Prisons are packed full of people with, if you don't come in, lots of people would say, well, if you weren't ill when you came in, it's only a matter of time kind of thing. Because prison is a factor in deteriorating mental health. There's, I think it's a Ben Cruz study. There's evidence for that. That being in prison does not do your mental health any good in terms of the environment, not in terms of the treatment you might receive. But it is shocking. And I remember working in a prison in the East Midlands, and this guy we found out eventually he had a traumatic brain injury and was very, his speech was very slow. We weren't sure if we were has he got a learning disability? What's the situation with this guy? And he'd had this car crash and he had this traumatic brain injury. So he had kind of very low IQ, slow speech, all the rest of it. And when we were like, why is this guy here? And the governor who was looking after us, because we were in doing workshops, I didn't work there long term, said, oh, it's £125,000 a year at the secure hospital down the road. So, I mean, he'll just do a sentence here because we're about 25 grand a year. And I was like, oh, that blew my mind. I just thought how many people are in our system and they are being looked after, if you want to call it that, or they're being held where they are because it's just too expensive. It's so much cheaper for someone to be in prison. Mm-hmm. And then in the case of people that have got profound and enduring mental illness and should be in a secure hospital, people can't get transferred out of prison. You know, like even when the prison, everyone in the system has agreed that you should not be there, which is a very, very high threshold. Actually trying to get transferred out is, it takes forever. No one meets any of the targets. And that's if you can get that agreement in the first place, which you really can't always get. And then you've got the more anxiety and depression end of thing, which can be, debilitating for some people, but that's barely the tip of the iceberg when you're talking about mental health stuff in prisons.
And what's the connection between mental health and criminality and incarceration?
Oh, gosh. I feel like that's the subject of a whole thesis, but maybe I should just tell you some stories of some of the people I work with. For some people who are maybe experiencing psychosis and things like that, voices might be telling you, to pull out your own veins or to hurt somebody in your family or, and that's not rational. That's not sane. Those actions are then not the actions of a sane and well person, So I think some of the violent stuff is so deeply connected. I feel like I don't even know how to answer this question. I need about 3 hours. Yeah, and a lot of the people I worked with had a kind of dual diagnosis situation where their traumatic and difficult life experiences had led them to misuse substances, and they were incredibly
And you see a
depressed.
connection between addiction and criminality as well.
Yeah, 100%. And they were kind of locked into this, I don't know where my terrible mental health and my addiction, I don't know where one begins and the other one ends, and to sustain my addiction I'm doing crime, but it's because I was raped repeatedly by my father, it's because and I'm trying to block that out with the heroin because that's an opiate, it's a painkiller, and that means I can stay alive, but I've got to rob this stuff so I can stay alive so I can get heroin, or for example. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? It's that kind of stuff. And the rates of self-harm and suicide in prisons also kind of testify to the terrible state of people's mental health in there.
We can go straight into that.
Yeah.
The suicide rate of prisoners in England and Wales per 10,000 people is 8.6. That's above the European median, which is 5.7. It's well below the Portuguese suicide rate in prison, which is 18.4.
Gosh.
For comparison's sake, the suicide rate in Europe for everyone is 1.3 per 10,000 people.
Yeah.
Why do so many prisoners take their own lives?
It's grim in there. There are many, many factors, and people like Sina Fazell, Alison Liebling, there's lots of good academic studies and evidence on the kind of factors, but at a real layperson basic level, it's grim in there. And the idea that prison is like some kind of holiday camp where everyone's just doing PlayStation all day is not true. People are, particularly during this pandemic time, been locked in their cells 23 hours a day. You might be locked in with someone you don't like, or somebody who is insane, or somebody, all these kind of things.
Or completely alone, which is also...
Or, sometimes you're kept alone for those. If you're an arsonist, they won't let you share a cell, so you're on your own, and then you're locked in at 23 hours a day, that kind of thing. And so little control over the times you get up, the times you go to bed, what you wear, what you eat, the things that we take for granted, the pants you wear, the shampoo you can get, I don't know, everything is limited, everything. And then you can't bear the pain of seeing your children, or your brother dies and it was sudden and you couldn't get there. And can you get the permissions to get to the funeral because you had a fight last week? So I don't even know if I can get out to my own brother's funeral. That's it. The things that create that despair, as well as the profound mental health stuff, as well as family relationships, people that breaking down over sentence lengths, as well as sometimes there's a kind of contagion. There might be a spate of suicides, as well as the fact that we're in these Victorian prisons with ligature points, as many as you could wish for. The architecture is not. We do have a limited number of things like safe cells, but some prisons are just, you can
not suicide-proof at all.
Not remotely. Although there's been some excellent innovation with a kind of zero suicide approach in HMP Liverpool, and again, I'm aware of pockets
there are
of
exceptions.
Good practice. Yeah, but it is.
But in general, do you find that prisons have any capacity to deal with suicide risk factors?
They do. They're managing, and this is something that comes up in my research, and I was involved in some ombudsman research as well, is that prisons are preventing way more suicides than are completed. They are keeping people alive with their reduced staff numbers, with their limited resources, with the crappy architecture that's basically, ligature paradise. They are still managing, hard-working, dedicated staff are still managing to prevent a number. But people still die by suicide in these crazy numbers in our prisons because of the overcrowding, because of the understaffing. And you can't be as effective in prevention when there's just less of you. If you've got 6 people on your wing on an act, which is what you open when somebody's suicidal, and you allocate, and people sometimes people really, really, really do want to kill themselves. And I've heard stories of people storing spare clothes to then make it look like they were in their bed asleep because they were on observation, and then they've killed themselves in a dark corner of the cell, and the person looking in because they could see a lump in the bed thought they were still, so there are things like that. But for some people how can you can't always ascribe intent in the case of a suicide, obviously, because you can't ask the person, but the resourcing thing is massive, and prisons do keep a lot of people alive and intervene and perform CPR on people and cut people down on an incredibly regular basis.
So the attempted suicide rate is much higher.
Significantly higher.
Than the actual suicide rate. Which then leads me to asking even more vehemently, is prison a risk factor? So being jailed... Yeah.
It's a risk. It's absolutely a risk factor, and there's a lot of academic evidence that would support that incarceration itself is a risk factor because of the level of despair. For all of those, there are many. There's a brilliant Prison Reform Trust paper that was produced with the Prisoner Policy Network that Lucy Wainwright led on about despair, about prisoner despair, and then also the impact of when somebody in prison dies and the impact on the other prisoners. And you can see how those cycles happen. And this is why, things like, why do we incarcerate people? There's a lot of research as well around people dying by suicide on their first night or in that very early part of a sentence because everything is too much. There are certain windows we might know of, but I guess essentially it comes down to despair.
The mortality rate per 10,000 inmates in Portugal was 65.7 in 2020. That's well above the European median, 28.6, still below the 77.5 in England and Wales. Why do so many people die in prison?
Yeah, well, aside from the people that die by suicide, which is devastating and should not happen, and devastating for their families, we have this curious category of natural cause deaths. And what is abundantly clear is people don't necessarily receive parity of care. They're meant to receive parity of healthcare with that in the community. But
meaning that they have equal access to healthcare as if they were free. Absolutely.
But people find a lump and they can't get a standard GP's, appointment free. So this morning I talked about Long Lartin prison where there was a year wait to see a GP, to see a general practitioner doctor. And so what if you find a lump, who do you go to? How do you get a referral? We have a national bowel cancer screening programme in the UK. I think it's for people over 65. how's that running in your prison? Is that, are you hitting your targets with that, or is that tricky for you to manage? Because again, that's going to rely on staff, numbers of people to do it, numbers of people to see you and refer you. What kind of food do we feed people in our prisons? Is that helping people that have maybe got high cholesterol, or is it just the cheapest stuff we can funnel into them? So there's this huge range of factors, a lot of which is about access, actually. A lot of it is about access to screening and healthcare. But there's a wider variety of factors that determine those so-called natural cause deaths. And I think because we've had such a problem with suicide, there hasn't been a particular interrogation in England and Wales about the high levels of natural cause death. Now, sometimes you read a PPO report, Prison and Probation Ombudsman, report, and you think, yeah, this person was 79 or 89, whatever, and they might have been in a prison with lots of older prisoners. They might have had really good end-of-life care, and you think, well, I think that's as it was, and that does happen. But there are a whole chunk of other natural cause deaths where you think that's untimely, and why weren't they screened? Why weren't they referred out? Why, So there's a lot of questions even over those natural cause deaths that really the number should be far lower.
Do you believe in a world without prisons?
Wow. I certainly believe in a world without prisons as we have them today. The damaging, massive societal dustbins that we call prison today. Do I believe in a world without prisons?
Because, as Foucault would say, you quoted him earlier, prisons are inherently unfair.
Yeah, and they just create so much damage. It's very difficult because I'm intensely pragmatic. So whether I believe in it, I can conceive of it, but do I believe that will happen in my lifetime, or can I be? I'm like, no.
You wouldn't consider yourself an abolitionist?
Almost, but not quite. Almost, but not quite. Almost, but not quite. I have
Why?
lots of amazing abolitionist friends. I think I don't know what we do about all the people that are incarcerated now in an abolitionist paradigm. I know I can hear them all tearing their hair out now as I'm even saying this. They're like, Sara, we've talked about this. This isn't how it works. But I think where we are culturally, and again, it's that broad cultural picture, being led by Trump and Boris Johnson, and where I see abolition sitting, that is not a journey I think we can go on in my lifetime. I wish I didn't feel that were true, but with all my heart I feel that's true. And I want to do what I can to alleviate the damage that crime causes to everybody, perpetrators and victims and the wider circle, to alleviate the damage in my lifetime. And if we could even set off on the journey towards abolition, I might be able to conceive of it in a more contemporary way. But I feel like we're not even on the first step of that journey. So until we hit the first step, I'm going to keep plugging away over here to try and make things better for all those people that are in the system. And it isn't either or. I know it's both and. I can really hear some of my friends tearing their hair out at the moment. But
and I would push you on.
Yeah, go for it.
You can use that exact same argument to do nothing about climate change. Yeah, the culture isn't there. We need the oil. Boris Johnson and Donald Trump aren't really into it.
I think that there has been a reckoning with climate stuff in the last 5 years, and I do think public opinion has shifted.
And that's why I'm pushing you on it, because why wouldn't there be a reckoning with prisons?
I will let people continue to try and bring that about. I'm happy for, I've been to abolitionist conferences, and I think I believe in a microscopic prison estate with prisons that aren't really prisons, but like small custodial units that is much more integrated within the community. But I just don't even know how I don't even know how we get there.
That way.
It's hard for me to articulate myself about this because I don't want to do down my abolitionist comrades at all. I don't, because I believe in it. But I guess that's just not the path I'm on.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you, Sara. Prison activist. I'll sum it up that way before I go back to Portuguese.
Esta entrevista foi preparada por mim, Nuno Viegas, a Margarida David Cardoso fez a edição, o Bernardo Afonso tratou do som, faz ainda parte da equipa Fumaça, Danilo Tomás, Frederico Rocha, Joana Batista, Luís Marquês, Maria Almeida, Pedro Miguel Santos, Ricardo Esteves Ribeiro. A música é dos Lotus Fever. Como habitual, apelo de fecho, nós queremos fazer do Fumaça a primeira redação profissional em Portugal, totalmente financiada pelo público. Se queres que continuemos a fazer este trabalho, faz uma contribuição mensal para o Fumaça. E junto da comunidade, basta ir a fumaca.pt/contribuir. O link também está na descrição deste episódio. Até já!